My name is Patricio Dávila, and I was born in Chile, and I've been in Canada for many decades.
My name is Immony. I was born in Thailand. I'm Cambodian, and my parents and I settled in Ottawa, and then and now I live in Toronto.
I think there's going to be two answers, maybe three, to that question about who inspires us, because it's individually, but it's also collaboratively. So something else happens when we collaborate. We work in a particular way that experiments with media, experiments with technologies, and tries to look at story, history, identity, gesture, movement, being together. Those are themes that go through a lot of the projects that we do. They might look differently, but they have that thread throughout. So when you think of artists that are community-based or work with participants, rather than creating the one perfect piece that will transcend time and space, we're much more not concerned, but kind of interested in the thing in the moment, making connections with people. So the work that we have here has a lot to do with what we've been doing for the past 4 years, especially during COVID, trying to be with other people. So what you have is a collection of process. So we've been working through experiments, talking to people, sharing stories, sharing experiences, having shared experiences. And what you see is the documentation of that, and then ways that we've tried to represent that in a few different ways.
I think what inspires our practice a lot, and I'm thinking about that thread that you mentioned, Patricio, around collaboration, our family and the stories and the relationships, and trying to use our creative practice to create something that might be familiar, that might help with sharing stories, sharing experience, and and creating something that we can use to remember our loved ones. So,
in particular, what inspired us for this was our common experience as refugees arriving in Canada. We arrived at different times and from different places, but there were many points of similarity in terms of how important family was, the role of language, the role of food, of being with others from family and from an extended family. And so our conversations often, when we talked about how it was to be in Canada and negotiating what it means to be Canadian, or in the Americas, it always centered as where we were from, where our parents were from, where food played a huge role in creating community, and what those spaces look like. So language was a big part. So when you speak Khmer or Spanish, you're in this space. So we really were interested in that. We were also thinking about a diasporic consciousness. So the fact that we bridge between two experiences from one part of the world and another part of the world, but we were both here, we shared a diasporic experience, and that, I think, broadened sort of our connection. So it isn't just about, are you from Chile? Are you from Cambodia? it's not a binary yes or no, and then that is the extent to which you relate to somebody. You relate to difference, to histories, and that kind of trajectory.
Passing Through the Heart originally started with this lunch conversation with Richard Fung. And then we started talking about how do we create essay films about cooking. And then we started to really think about the ways that we can record these gestures that are connected to cooking, but also create these affective reference points that can be led by text, it can be led by voice, it can be led by video, and we also wanted to include motion capture technology to also record the body, and then create this what we're calling records for remembering those particular recipes and the people that are sharing it and what is surrounding that particular recording process. So is that?
Yeah. Part of the idea for the project was a joke. Like, how are we, like, what would make cooking better? It's like you put a motion capture suit on and start cooking. And it didn't, it wasn't a punchline. It was just kind of like something, like an idea that was kind of ridiculous. But then the more we thought about it, the more we liked the experimental nature. We hadn't seen too many examples of it, apart from gesture analysis done for industrial work at the turn of the century, the previous century. And so we were thinking maybe this sort of domestic work done by families and people to create community could be something that could be used in that, or motion capture could be used to remember that. Also quite important for us was we were collaborating for a while already, but over the past 2 years we went through a lot of challenges. So we recorded my father with the motion capture suit, and then I think it was about 2 years later he passed away. So what we had was video recordings, but also motion recordings of his body. So we started thinking about it as this recording without a lens, and you can see his body move in space, but there was only the movement to reference him. And part of what we wanted to understand was, like, could we still recognize the person through the movement? Later on, my mother died as well, so it was a very tough year. And a little bit later on, Immony's mom suffered a health crisis. And so the mortality of our parents, the links that are there, became very much the center of what we were thinking about. So through collaboration, part of the collaboration is sharing. So we're sharing those experiences, and we're sharing that sense of, like, what does it mean to have parents? And so once again, when we think about the spaces created through these events, through these practices, our family members, chosen family members, help us create that space. So when they're no longer there, it becomes a thing for us to either mourn that space or try to create that space again and regenerate that space and continue something.
And you were mentioning through the production process, like, there were these moments where there are really intimate gestures, or moments where you were repairing the motion data and you were trying to remember the body language or the way that your father's arm would move, and through memory it would help with that type of repair, that type of editing of motion data. And I don't think that's something that's usually associated to that particular production technique.
In production, visual effects data tends to be very computer-oriented, math-oriented. quantified as opposed to qualitative. And so there was very much a qualitative aspect, almost meditative aspect when you're going over a virtual body and looking at a person over and over again. The title of the work is Passing Through the Heart, which is a definition of the word recordando. And recordando means, or recordar, means to pass through, to pass through the heart, el corazón. So that's where we got that notion, and it has resonated throughout. And we keep on thinking of that term, remembering, passing through, feeling, not just thinking but feeling. And so that has, I think it was a good title because it kept on giving us a sort of a core idea of what this is all about.
In this particular work, I think what's quite central. First there were several different iterations. So that's what you see within the documentation. There was a moment where we started thinking through the recording process as a workshop for ICEA. And so during the pandemic, we had to think about how do we extend the virtual production space and the cooking space across multiple screens through Zoom, and include different participants where we cooked with folks virtually. We had these conversations about diasporic identity, about food, about how practice is used to create these records for remembering. And then it became an exhibition at Squeaky Wheel where there were 3 or 4 episodes for this virtual cooking show. And now we're at this iteration where it's an exhibition at Onsite, and there are 2 works. Like one is, I'll let Patricio speak about his father, but one is one of the works is focused on my mother, and she's teaching me how to make a Cambodian crepe. And it's not present in the motion data, but her presence is there as she's teaching me how to make this crepe, the gestures that are connected to pouring the crepe, distributing the flour, distributing the ingredients, folding it, plating it, and she's not there in the data, but she's there teaching me how to create this particular recipe. And visually, in the video, she's quite present, and her voice is present, and her movement is present. So,
the other works that we've done over the past, it's almost a decade now, but has worked a lot with the opportunities or the situations that we come across. So we've been kind of opportunistic, I think, where we either find stories or we're presented with a situation where we can respond. And the fact that we work with public forms of engagement through visualization, hence the name Public Visualization Lab and Studio that we're both part of, but also forms of data making, data collection, workshops, and exhibitions and curing. So we've done a whole bunch of things. So to say that there's one thread that ties everything is it's frustrating to say no. There's not one key thing. There is an ethics that we apply to a lot of what we do. We want to try to help tell stories that have been marginalized, either through systemic oppression, systemic racism, different forms of exclusion or displacement. And that's been an ongoing concern that guides us. So I think we touched upon certain aspects of that. The process for passing through the heart was a multi-year experiment looking at gesture and cooking. And it took on different shapes because of COVID, because of the physical distancing needed in order to control the pandemic. And so we did things on Zoom. We did things in a multi-screen Zoom event that we did for a art conference, where we put many different cameras, many different Zoom accounts, so that you can have sort of a multi-perspective view of the story we were trying to tell. And part of it was live performance by Immony, cooking and demonstrating. So it was a cooking show. Basically, if you want to boil it down to one thing, it was a cooking show. But where we talked a lot about the role of food in community. And so that was one installation. Another one was where we worked with invited artists who, over Zoom again, showed us recipes and cooked with us through Zoom. We'd seen that this was a phenomenon, especially during the pandemic, where people would just be together on Zoom, doing mundane things. And one of the things people tended to do was cook. And so we used that as an inspiration for sharing. If we couldn't be there physically together, we would be there virtually. So we brought in the technologies of motion capture, which we like to think of as motion recording, as opposed to capture. Capture seems to have this sort of taking, extractive sort of logic around it. So we want to think about it as recording, especially for the uses that we're doing with it. And so we have this motion recording, we have photogrammetry, and those two things kind of come together where you either record people's motion or you start taking photos of physical objects and create 3D objects. They're both in the service of creating something in a 3D world. And that's what we did in the piece of Passing Through the Heart. They don't look all that 3D because we've abstracted them, we've made them more painterly, we've made them more expressive of different materials and color, as opposed to the original thing. So you see people coming in and out of highlights and shadows, and you suddenly see a person, you suddenly see limbs and a gesture. You see blotches of color that were derived from photogrammetry, from this 3D process. But it's not the actual thing itself or a very high resolution version of itself. It's something else, so something more graphic, more visually abstract. And then there were the interviews that we have. One with Immony's mom and one with my dad. And in those interviews, they're not just interviews, they're actually, they're teaching us how to do a particular thing, and they're explaining the steps and some of the choices.
Yeah, and as we stepped through some of those iterations, what started to come out through it were these, especially the second iteration where we invited guests. You know, these conversations about things that were very familiar, like calling cards, and like calling cards that we would purchase to call our relatives that are not in this country, or that are far from us, and like to hear their voices and to get information about their lives. And so so there were these like really intimate conversations that came out while we were cooking, while we were recording with the motion capture suit, while we were performing, while we're learning how to cook particular recipes that folks were sharing with us. And And yeah, so those conversations were really interesting, and they have a pretty big role in shaping that iteration of the experience.
We both found that we connected on that one aspect of when you have a calling card, or in my case, before calling cards, were just like a whole roll of quarters. And when you would call family, they would feel very far away. They'd sound very far away. And in my case, you'd have like to keep on putting the quarters in, and it was like, it wasn't an endless resource. It was a very limited time, because of how many quarters you had, and you just felt the thing just going away, just falling like sand through your hands. It's like you can't be with them, and it's kind of dissipating as you're talking. Same with the calling cards. It's like you have a certain amount, and you're going to run out of that time, and then that's when the connection is severed. And so, in that connection, you could really hear how fragile the technological connection was too. It was these cables that were transatlantic, transpacific connections, and they were teeny tiny voices, and so the distance was really felt. Mm-hmm. And so when we started doing it on Zoom with collaborators, it was kind of interesting. It's much advanced, and it seemed like we could be on Zoom forever, but it still had that idea that distance. Mm. That was kind of like part of thinking about how to remember. That distance is spatial, but can also be temporal. I think it's this notion of diasporic consciousness, which really thinks about the commonality of experiences and how arriving, in some cases settling, some cases running to a country, running to safety, is something that can be shared amongst people who otherwise have different histories, different languages, different countries of origin. And so, but that trajectory, that difference helps create some community, and in that sense, create some resilience, and helps us move forward and survive. So in the case of Immony and I, we're both from different histories, but they have parallel structures, and we're both here. And so we have that consciousness, that diasporic consciousness, which allows us to share things that might be foreign to folks who haven't experienced the same thing. So when, in the terms of the show, it feels really like a great opportunity for people to see these different expressions from folks who've arrived or have moved around in the Americas, and how that might look like. Either there's a calling back to a country of origin, or there might be the impact of having arrived. And yeah, so I think it's a good collection to be able to reflect on that.
I think about some of the traces and patterns that we talk about that exist within practices such as cooking, such as substitution, like substituting ingredients, and that gesture is very familiar. So there's moments where we talk about substitution, and translation, being in between translation, connections that are fractured, and how do we? Yeah, I think those traces, those diasporic traces, are so familiar in what we talk about in terms of our collaboration, our relationship with our own family, our relationship with community. So I think these two works, it might not be what's what's at the front of it, but those are some of the notes that I'm drawn to when I see them together.
So the notion of Americanity for me seems like a highly problematic and contested notion, an idea, on a bunch of different levels. Americanity, as opposed where you would be able to identify a thing, a quality of being. When you try to make those definitions, often you have to, you kind of cut things out. So Americanity seems like there's a moment when Americanness, and in this sense I think we're thinking about all of the Americas, from north to south. From that point onwards, what is that? But it also does violence to a pre-colonial sort of moment. So it leaves that part out, even though it kind of tries to set out a space that is very encompassing and very large. It's, at the same time, I think it's almost like it's a meaningless word. It provokes, and I think in that sense it's a useful word, but it provokes something, and for me it almost becomes meaningless because, especially in contemporary moment, there's so many different influences on the identity of someone who lives here, who's come here, who's been here for multiple generations, that it's like, and there's so many ties to around the world that to say that there's something that is unique or specific to Americanness, it's hard for me to kind of like buy into that. But I think it's a useful provocation, though.
I thought about this at home, and I'm thinking about it now after you mentioned that, Patricio, and I was thinking about it earlier when I was going to the washroom, but I think it's really complicated for folks who seek refuge on land that's not theirs, that has had such a large colonial presence, and and then and living with these different diasporic communities. I'm trying to think through not the usefulness of that term, but also think through like my relationship with that word, and I can't put a finger on it right now. Like I've thought a lot about it.
I think the word is useful because it kind of it almost destroys itself when you think about it for more than a few seconds. At face value, you think, oh, I know what that might be. But upon closer inspection, I think it undoes itself. And that's why for us, when we think about it, it kind of puts us into a fatal error loop. So it just keeps on going. The system's gonna freeze or crash if we think about it too much, because of that thing that it undoes itself. When you think about diaspora, when you think about refugees, when you think about indigeneity, when you think about sovereignty, when you think about globalization,